Hey everyone, welcome to Frank Analysis. I'm your host, Franco. I am joined by my good friend Ramiro Sebastian Funes, returning to the show. He's been a guest on here a couple times. He's an independent commentator and analyst, political analyst, Marxist-Leninist. He's also a good friend of Caleb Maupin, who's been on the show a few times. So, Ramiro, it's great to have you on, sir. How are you?
Thanks for having me back on, Franco. Really appreciate your channel, your show. And what I like about your channel is that you're one of the few guys out there who are actually calling out big pharma, mainstream media, the lies themselves. One of the left, unfortunately, is afraid to speak out against these entities and how they are destroying our lives. And your content is great, man. Your channel is really fantastic, and I'm always glad to be on.
Appreciate it, man. Those are really kind words. And yeah, I like getting to the root of it. A lot of people talk about the billionaires and the corporations and everything, which is fine, but let's get at the root of it. Why do they do this? Why do they why do they choose certain crises, right? Like for example, the virus and everything. And people may call us like tinfoil hat conspiracy theorists and everything, but even though things that we say are backed up by evidence. Now, you had a great interview the other day. I highly recommend people to watch it with Mohsin Abbas, who is a Press TV journalist about the Rothschilds family. So I have it up here. You played many great clips. Now, as a Marxist-Leninist, coming from that perspective, why should people care about the Rothschilds, do you think?
I think it's important for everyone in the world to study the Rothschilds, not even Marxists and communists, but anyone who cares about humanity,
Right.
because here we have a family that is responsible for ushering in one of the most vicious parasitic forms of capitalism that has existed. Just kind of back up and give some context on the Rothschild family. Mayor Amschel Rothschild, patriarch of the Rothschild family from Germany, with Ashkenazi roots, and his family dynasty began with his five sons, who
Yeah.
he groomed to take over Europe and to become the new ruling class of Europe during the 18th and 19th centuries, in particular the 19th century, the 1800s. Basically, this guy had five sons. Before he passed away, he had each of them move to major cities in Europe: London, Vienna, Paris. And so that's how the Rothschild family began. You had these brothers who spread their wealth throughout Europe. And what's interesting about the Rothschild family is that they began one of the most horrific tactics of capitalism and imperialism, which is divide and conquer, which is playing both sides, funding both sides, which is making money through war, violence, and greed. And something that is really horrible to look at. For example, in the 1800s, the Rothschild family was one of the biggest supporters of the British royal family, the royal crown. And they were one of the top advisors to the British crown when England was carrying out its two opium wars against China in the early 1800s, with the support of the French imperialists as well, who also were supported by the Rothschilds. And what's interesting is that not only the power of money and the power of controlling people through divide and conquer strategies, but also drugs. We're talking about Mayor Amschel
Mm.
Rothschild himself, somebody a student of alchemy, and somebody who dabbled with the occult and dabbled with black magic. And at this time, you have rise of opiates and opium. In India, in particular, the British were growing poppy and basically converting this poppy into opium, selling it to the Chinese. So you have the British imperialists taking over India, starving them to death, then taking and perverting whatever grows on their land, poppy, perverting it into a synthetic drug, bringing it to China for the Chinese to buy this drug, and drug them, enslave them, and take all of their shit and go back to Europe. Like that's one of the most evil things I can think of. And listen up there, the Rothschilds also supported the colonization of South Africa. They supported apartheid. They supported a lot of the diamond processing mines in South Africa, where a lot, especially in Zimbabwe, which used to be known as Rhodesia during the colonial era. Seth Rhodes, somebody who's extremely supported by the Rothschild family. Also in New Mexico, the Rothschild family supported the construction of the Rio Tinto mine, the mine that kicked out native Navajo indigenous peoples from their land, extract resources, minerals to create these synthetic goods and sell them on the market. Also, the Rothschild family was heavily invested in French colonialism, in particular in the sugar trade. You have the Rothschild family, the French wing, supporting the colonization of Haiti, back then it was Santo Domingo, the island, Hispaniola, which included Dominican Republic and Haiti. They supported these French slave traders. They basically brought enslaved Africans to what's today Haiti. They forced them to process sugar to create a perverted synthetic version of it and sell it back to Europe to use it in alcohol, to use it in tea. And we all know that how bad sugar is for us, you know. So you
Yeah.
have this family that's ordering the French slave traders to steal, to kidnap Africans, have them create a horrible poisonous synthetic substance to sell for magic money squares to then make themselves rich. There's so many levels to this, and even as well. Exactly right. Sugar, rubber, opium, and alcohol. All of the within alchemy, all of the elements that are used to control and manipulate the masses, like alcohol, sugar, like all the things that are really responsible. You know, tying this to COVID, you know, we can talk about obesity and heart disease and alcoholism
Right.
being one of the
The-
big issues right now for so many people. So this is like a little glimpse into what this family has been invested into, and it's still impacting us today.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, they shape the way that our world looks like today. And like showing over here in your interview that you had on your channel, there's a little context that's given at the bottom of the video, which I'm sure that this video is probably also going to get, which links us to the Encyclopedia Britannica, which mentions how like they've held a powerful position for some 200 years. Now, since then, they've been able to help vet other powerful people like the Rockefellers and our current billionaires of today. The top richest billionaires are Elon Musk, Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos. All these people received help from banks which the Rothschilds family have control over. Now, we can ask ourselves why do we have to have sugar? Why do we have to have so much alcohol be so prevalent in our society? Does it have to be this way? I don't know if some people ask themselves that question enough, but we should, because going back to ancient history, this is not the way that our ancestors would live. They didn't live with so much prevalence of alcohol and sugar, and not only that, but now we have all these genetically modified foods which are tied with autoimmune diseases and all these other conditions, comorbidities that make us reliant on the pharmaceutical industry, which they also have control over, and they profit off of the Rothschilds family, the Rockefellers. Now, what are because some people are going to say, well, when I look at the list of the wealthiest people in the world, I don't see like the Rothschilds aren't like up there with Elon Musk and Bill Gates and all these people. Well, actually, that's because their wealth is incalculable, and like it's beyond the billions now. They have little techniques in which they can hide their true wealth. So you want to tell us about that a little bit? I know that's something that you spoke with your
Yeah,
guest in that interview.
yeah. I think as Mosen correctly pointed out during the stream, the 1% of the global ruling class have powerful ways of distributing their wealth. They are the biggest magicians in the world. The ruling class, the imperialists, are the biggest magicians. They have the ability to conceal their wealth in a number of ways. And one of the ways in which they do this is creating shell companies, creating offshore tax havens where they can move their wealth around. And all they have to do is simply fund, create an account, transfer their funds there, name it some LLC, Franco Enterprise LLC, and that's it. And it seems like that wealth is away from them, but in reality, it belongs to them. And I think one of the most important things to mention with, in particular, the Rothschild family is that they have a very impressive ability to hide their wealth more than other families, because a lot of people tend to focus on the sort of lower crust of the one global 1%. A lot of people talk about Trump. A lot of people talk about, Bezos. In reality, if we look at the Rothschild family, which still has tons of money and power today, they're probably more powerful than all of them combined, but they don't want that heat on them, right? They're operating behind the scenes. They're operating behind the covers so that nobody attacks them. But in many ways, if we look at the European Union, the US, the Federal Reserve, the preeminent faces of global capitalism, they are controlled and dominated by the Rothschild machine, the banking institutions, and the users, because that's really what it comes down to, is usury, the system that basically creates something out of nothing. It's very, if we look at it, it's going back to, I hate to sound, I'm going to put on my tinfoil sombrero. I still gotta make one pretty soon, because that's what some people have been saying. But if we look at within the realm of the spirituality, it's some really dark magic shit, right? Because what they do, what these 1% banking elites do, is that they make tons of value, create tons of exchange value from use value. So just to kind of break this down, Marx talks about this in Capital. There's a difference between use value and exchange value, right? So use value is something that has inherent use, something like an apple, something like a car, or something that you can use to eat or feed yourself, or to clothe yourself, or to shelter yourself with, right? These things have inherent use value that we can protect ourselves with. Exchange value is a little different. Exchange value is something that is socially determined, meaning that within a particular society, aka capitalism, a diamond can have tons of exchange value.
He'll be back. Just gonna wait a little more and he'll probably show back up. Right, let me see if I remove and then bring back to the stream, if that does anything. All right, he'll probably come back on. But in the meantime, let's take a look at what some of you guys said. Yeah, that was funny what he said about tinfoil sombrero. But I mean, I don't know if we're going to touch too much on that, like the occult stuff here in this interview. But if you're interested in that, I mean, there is, Jason Burmas talks about some of that in some of his interviews. I've discussed it a little bit here with some of my guests, like Shadowban Refugee and Marcus Cage and Jack Sith. I mean, we don't have to believe in this stuff, but if we look at what some of the symbolism and some of the stuff that they do in their statues in DC and in New York City, I mean, some of their practices, it looks like some of these elites, they believe in it. So you don't have to believe in that stuff, but I mean, these people do. NGOs for sure. And then Lysenko Med School says, a Zizekian Marxist told me he doesn't talk about the Rothschilds because there are fascists who do. The Western left is literally a joke. Wow. So you're telling me this person is afraid to talk about them because there are fascists that talk about them? I mean, the Rothschilds are the fascists. They're the ones that are integrating the public and private sector together. All right, so we got Ramiro back. What's going on,
Sorry about
man? We
that.
lost connection there.
Sorry about that.
All
Weird timing,
good.
right?
Yeah, I know. Yeah, the topic and everything. Yeah, you
Yeah.
were spitting too much facts there, but go ahead.
Yeah, no worries, man. Sorry about that. But yeah, so basically, Marx makes a distinction between use value and exchange value. Use value is something that we use on a day-to-day basis: apples, food, wood for fire, something to that actually has use for us. Exchange value is really a product of capitalism, where you have something like a diamond or something like that has no intrinsic value. You can't eat a diamond. You can't feed your family or shelter yourself with a diamond. It just looks nice. But so
Yeah.
under capitalism, exchange value is socially determined. It's determined by the rulers of that society using media, using propaganda. And this is where media plays in. This is where you have the Rothschild family also funding the creation of Hollywood. A lot of the early industry giants of Hollywood, Columbia Pictures, Fox Films, all of these major Hollywood studios were created by Rothschild associated banking industries, film giants who understood the power of media, that by taking hold of media, by taking hold of film, you can create exchange value. You can make people think that diamonds have value. You can make people think that smoking a cigarette is cool. You can make people think that something is a threat or is not a threat. And this ties in with the power of media today, where they've created the setup where if in any way you critique the Rothschild family or many others, it's not even just the Rothschild, there's so many others who are like them, who
Yeah.
do these banksters that I like to call them, capitalists, who do these sort of schemes and maneuvers. If you call them out, all of a sudden you're crazy, you're a conspiracy theorist, you're hateful, and it's the perfect setup because now they draw up in the media the image of the paranoid. I don't know, Franco, if you have you seen that commercial on YouTube for kayak? Do you know what kayak is?
Yeah, I know what kayak is. Is
So
it?
it's
I
like
don't know
that.
about if there's a brand, but I know what kayaking is. Like that little boat that you get on when you stream on a stream.
Right, exactly. So there's a commercial on YouTube for this big company called Kayak. It's a travel company. And whatever, it's some random travel agency thing, whatever. And the commercial for Kayak, it makes fun of quote unquote conspiracy theorists. It makes fun of people who are questioning official narratives. And in a way, what they're doing is they want us to turn off our brains. They want us to stay silent, to stop questioning stuff, to be like, hey, something seems off about Building 7 falling on its own. Something seems off about this COVID-19 stuff.
Yeah.
Something seems off about, all these different things. And they want to shame you into not questioning stuff. And this is the opposite of what the left should be doing. The left should be questioning everything. The left should be against big pharma, against the big capitalists who run society and media. And the Rothschild the family is just one branch of that. And so I think, it's important for people to really not fall for these magic spells and tricks, because it's not only finance and currency that they control, it's also media. And I think media really comes down to one of the most powerful weapons on earth, as Malcolm X said.
Oh, absolutely, and they have control over Vanguard and BlackRock, two wealthy foundations here. And look at this. Like if we just go over here, this is on projects.iq.harvard.edu. You can look at their project here, the Future of Media Project, to see who funds these organizations. We see here Wikipedia. Moving on to the internet now that we have things like Wikipedia, and they can use that, a trusted source, and then they link things to Wikipedia on their YouTube videos, etc. If it's about the Rothschilds family, or if it's about COVID-19, or elections, or other stuff, or they can link you to the AP. Here we see Fox, CNN, the EW, ABC News, all these mainstream outlets, which also are part of a conglomerate with these Hollywood studios. I mean, they have control over this, so they can control the narrative. They can make you think, which is what Ramiro and his guest talked about on that show. What Ramiro was talking about here about diamonds, they can make you think that diamonds are worth a lot when they're actually pretty prevalent on Earth. Like they're not that rare, but they make you think that you need it. They make you think that you need to impress all your friends. Oh, look, I have a diamond. Bob, I have a diamond ring. So they also the way that the media works is that it can trickle down. Unfortunately, some independent media are so indoctrinated into this system that we have that they still repeat things that the mainstream media says, even though they call themselves independent media, and they call anybody who's questioning mainstream narratives conspiracy theorists. I mean, we saw that a lot with COVID-19. We see that with foreign policy. And they can also point the finger, oh, look at Alex Jones. He's saying all these crazy things that go against the narrative. But
Yep.
you could question, like, maybe they have people like Alex Jones there to make people who question narratives look ridiculous. Do you think about the timing in which he became more of a prominent figure during 9/11 and when he started doing all these ridiculous things? Like, I mean, we should question that. Just because someone ridiculous is going against some narrative doesn't mean that some of the stuff that they're saying isn't true. Of course, a lot of the things that they're saying, they're blowing out of proportion and it becomes untrue. That's why it should be up to you guys to look deeper into the evidence yourself and determine what is true and what's not. Ramiro, you have any comments about that?
Dude, that's such a great point, man, because Alex Jones, I think, is a perfect example of somebody who's used as a scarecrow, somebody who's used as a control valve for the imperialists. And I find it interesting that Alex Jones, he's playing the role, he's playing a character of a quote-unquote conspiracy theorist. And in a way, you just by looking at who he critiques and who he doesn't, you can see who his masters are. I find it interesting, for example, that Alex Jones, when talking about the opioid crisis, right? We have this huge crisis in the U.S., the opioid crisis that is killing thousands of people, especially in the Rust Belt. And who does Alex Jones blame for this opioid crisis? He blames China. He says China is responsible, the Chi-Coms. He says that the Chinese are plotting this conspiracy to take over the U.S. and drug everybody up. Well, he has it the reverse. It's actually the Western imperialists who have been doing that for centuries, aka the Rothschilds and others, the Sassoon family, the Kadoorie family, that's been doing that in China for centuries. And he's not even pointing the finger at the Sackler family, the family that is responsible for OxyContin and all these other pharmaceuticals. They never get criticized. Israel, one of the largest manufacturers of synthetic drugs, never gets criticized. So I just find it interesting that you have people out there who play the role of the crazy conspiracy theorists, and yet their role, their function is to divert people away from critiquing who the real enemies are and sort of divert it. Oh, it's China. Oh, it's Russia. And I find that really interesting. That's why, like, for me, I like talking to you about this, Franco, because a lot of times, people on the left are very liberal leaning, unfortunately, and they tend to be, anytime something like Rothschild or conspiracy comes up, they're like, oh my God, here we go.
Yeah.
Like they're kind of scared. They're scared to question, even though we all have the same doubts about 9/11. We all have the same doubts about masks and COVID, but they're scared to admit it, right? Because of their liberal friends who are going to shame them. But then on the other hand, on the other extreme, you have the right wingers who fall for a lot of the Zionist propaganda. Like they'll talk about like Eddie Bravo and Alex Jones and all these people. They'll talk about 9/11. They'll talk about opioid crisis, all that stuff. But then they're like, oh, it's China. Oh, it's this. Like they take it in a whole different neocon direction.
Or even like a stranger, they say, oh, it's the aliens, or they say like all these outlandish things, right?
Right. Exactly. They're like, oh, it's some demonic alien force that's taking over, and so like you see both of these tendencies that are pretty inadequate in addressing real questions that we have as a civilization, as a people. And I think it's up to people like us who are able to talk to multiple sides, who have a more class-based analysis, and are not afraid. I think most importantly, man, the most important thing I think is maintaining independence. Like, you're not you're not on the clock for some liberal NGO right now. You don't work for Politico. You don't work for fucking Media Matters or all these whack ass institutions, or Jacobin or whatever. Like, both you and I, we're just dudes who have streams, who talk to. We're just like having fun, We're talking to our friends, talking to people. We're getting the news out there. We don't have any masters controlling us, so we have the ability to have this conversation naturally. Imagine if right now we were on the clock for some Soros NGO, like, even talking about this stuff, they'd fucking lose their minds. So I think independence is really what it comes down to. And what happens is that a lot of these quote unquote independent journalists or media people, they start getting sucked into the Zionist controlled, capitalist controlled media institutions, Rolling Stone and the DSA, like all these kind of like left-leaning elements of the ruling class. They get their nice little check, they get their nice little studio, and all of a sudden their line starts to change. They can't be talking about the Rothschilds, they can't be talking about this other stuff. So that's really what it comes down to. That's why it's important for people, whoever's watching and listening, support Franco, support myself, support people like us, because at the end of the day, like, we're just talking to you like our friends in the street. Like, I just came out of work right now, out of the construction site. I'm talking to y'all right now like I talk to my homies at the construction site, and that's how it should be,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because there's no strings attached that way, right? And you brought up like, things like, it's anti-Semitic or whatever when you talk about the Rothschilds, because this is like an Ashkenazi Jewish family. So similar to how when you criticize Israel, an apartheid state occupying Palestine, they say, "Oh, you're anti-Semitic for criticizing that. How could you?" Blah 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 blah. Like, where's that originally coming from? That narrative, the media says things like that, and then some top politicians repeat that, and some people on the right who fall for those Zionist propaganda also repeat that. And when you tell people about, hey, I mean, the banks from the U.S. were funding World War II and were funding Nazis, they say that's conspiracy theory. How could you say that? No. Like, I've even seen like anti-imperialists say that, people who call themselves anti-imperialists, people who call themselves like Marxists, say that it's anti-Semitic propaganda to say that Jewish people were funding World War II.
Yeah.
So could you speak to that?
Dude, that's such a great point. I mean, here's the thing. It's the perfect spell. It's the perfect way to defend yourself against. First of all, I want to break down this term anti-Semitic, because Semitic refers to a language. There are Semitic languages. Arabic is a Semitic language. Aramaic is a Semitic language. Phoenician is a Semitic language. So even the term that's used is not even correct in terms of identifying what it is. Has there been genuine attacks and racism and discrimination against Jewish people? 100%. We can talk about the ghettos. The word ghetto itself comes from Italy, from the 14 and 1500s, where in Venice, the Jewish people were forced to live in the ghettos in Italian, or the ghettos. So that is a reality. However, you can't deny objective history. When you look at objective history, for example, you look at the slave trade, there were a lot of Jewish bankers who played a role in the slave trade. I'm sorry to say that. That's just reality. And there were also non-Jewish bankers who played a role in the slave trade. That is reality. When we talk about, Israel and Zionism, the Rothschild family played a major role in funding the creation of the state of Israel. When we talk about BlackRock and all these major financing banking companies, a lot of them are Zionists. A lot of the, BlackRock, what's the other, Morgan Stanley, what's the other one? There's so many. all of these institutions
Goldman
we can't
Sachs.
deny.
So
Yeah,
yeah.
Goldman Sachs. Like, look, if we really study the history, like, look at the key people. Look at even not even just in finance, but look at government. Abrams, so it's Elliot Abrams, one of the biggest neocons who was pushing against war against China during the Trump administration. Sheldon Adelson, one of Trump's biggest backers, Zion Don, as I call him, he another big Zionist, right? There is such a thing as a Zionist lobby and Israel lobby in the U.S., and it's a reality, and people are scared to critique it because the Israel Zionist lobby controls so much of the left. Like, that's the crazy part, is that by controlling, and this is connected to the Rothschild family, right? Where during the Peninsular Wars in Europe, you had the battles between England and Napoleon and France. The Rothschild family was banking both sides so that whoever won the war, the Rothschilds won, right? And this is a tactic that has been used over and over and over again, where you create a false dichotomy, you support both sides, liberal, Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative. Whoever wins, look at, it's not like Israel has gotten any funding slashed. It doesn't matter if it's Trump in office or Biden in office. They're all Zionists at the end of the day. Like, Israel wins and global capitalism wins. So, it's not for people to say, critiquing imperialism or capitalism is anti-Semitic. It's like, wow, you're basically repeating a talking point that somebody is saying that is ruling you and controlling over you, and not even from a particular ethnic or religious group, but just from a class. Like, as soon as people say that, critiquing, even saying international bankers, when people say that, that's anti-Semitic, it's like, how, like, that's intended to silence you. That's designed to keep you from speaking out, from questioning things. It's reverse psychology, and I think it's sad to see that so many people fall for it. And it's just something that I think a lot of people on the left are scared to touch, scared to address, because at the end of the day, if you critique the Israel lobby, if you critique especially in particular the liberal Zionists, you're going to lose your hustle. You're not going to get a job at the publication you want. You're not going to have your little blog, your podcast, because they don't like that kind of talk. They don't want you to be critiquing. There's always that line, there's always, and I just find it fascinating too, because when I first started getting into leftism, it's interesting because I heard about, do you know DSA, Franco?
Of course I know DSA. We talk
Okay,
about
so
them
I
here.
heard about, right. So I heard about DSA. I was like, oh, okay, like, if I'm a socialist, okay, maybe I should check out DSA, whatever.
Yeah,
Cool.
yeah. But for the people who don't know, it's the Democratic Socialists of America, who are very sensitive people, and they back the social imperialists like
Right.
AOC and Ilhan Omar and all these, fraud squad members.
Exactly. And I remember, like, when I first started getting involved with leftism and seeing what they're saying and, like, bringing up Israel, they get real shaky when you bring up Israel and Zionism and stuff like that. But they love calling out, like, just poverty or whatever, which I agree with, obviously. But then, like, they hate groups like DSA, hate Iran, right? Groups like a lot of the liberal, like, soy latte leftists, like, they hate Iran. They're like, oh, it's fascist, it's horrible, it's this and that. But then when you, like, look at Iran, like, they're one of the few countries and governments that actually calls out Israel, calls out big pharma, Pfizer. They call out the Israeli security firms and porn and drugs. And to a lot of the synthetic left, liberal left, soy left, they are horrified of that kind of talk because, they're supported by a lot of these Zionist institutions, DSA and all these Social Democrats of America. They were all connected to the Trotskyites who were backed by the Zionists as well. So it's just interesting because within the quote unquote American left, you have controlled opposition that is run by Israel. We have Ben Norton. I don't know if you remember that tweet that he put out where he found out that Jacobin
yeah.
Funding from the Jewish Communal Fund. Like, that's big, man. Like, that's a big deal because what that shows you is that you have an institution like Israel, because you're like, wait a second, Jacobin speaks out against Israel all the time. Like, why would they fund a publication that is speaking out against your country? Well, it's a controlled release, right?
Yeah.
It's like a car. It's like if you're doing so much horrible shit in the world, you need a control valve You need something, a mechanism in place so that you can slowly release that tension and direct it in a way that's not going to blow up your car. And that's what Jacobin is. That's what DSA is. That's what these soy liberal organizations are. They are the exchange, the exhaust pipes of Zionist imperialism, where they can be like, we'll give a little slap to Israel. You know, we'll call for the two-state solution, but we're not going to go the full way and be like, no, Israel does not deserve to controlled opposition. Exactly. So I just find it fascinating. Don't get bullied into these labels. You know, don't get bullied into like even COVID denier, even like anti-Semitic, conspiracy,
anti-vaxxer, like all these terms that they come up with.
Exactly, dude. Yeah,
like Nazbol, like we all know, like the freaking the synthetic leftists, the bread tubers, the terms that they come up with when they run out of talking points, they just resort to insults like that, right?
Exactly, dude. Yeah.
Yeah, so like Jacobin magazine is funded by Israeli lobbyists. I mean, that's just what the audience is saying. It's controlled opposition, limited hangout, and we see throughout history, like you mentioned, that the Rothschilds family would fund both sides of wars. Like all these wars, all of American history, even before that, these wars had to do with the banks. When people say, yeah, well, doesn't also have to do with resources? Yeah, it has to do with resources, but I mean, that's tied with making money and all that, in which case the banks get involved. And that's where the Rothschilds had control over. They had control over the banks. So you want to tell us a little bit about that? Why would they fund both sides of all these wars throughout history?
Most definitely. I think before talking about the funding of both sides, it's interesting that the banking institutions, banking is such a useless, parasitic field of industry. And this is why Lenin described imperialism as the high stage of capitalism defined by finance, capital, and banking institutions. You don't have, like, there's a difference between a capitalist who runs like a car manufacturing plant and gets his hands dirty and builds cars and something that people use versus like a head finance hedge fund guy at fucking Goldman Sachs. Like, that guy is not making anything at the end of the day. He's just crunching numbers and magic squares and paper and moving it around from city to city around the world. So banking, they use even though it's so useless, some of the magic that they do with their terminology is that they equate money to water, right? Humans need water. Over 90% of our body is water. And they use a lot of water terms in banking. Currency, current, a bank, like a river bank, right? If you're a solvent, if you're underwater, you know, revenue, right? Current, flow, like all these terms that allude to water that give money and capital the appearance, the illusion of life, of bringing life to something. When our people have for thousands of years lived and survived very healthy and happily without money, without banking institutions. So that's one of the ways that they use this word magic to basically equate money and banking and capital with life. In terms of the funding both sides, what it really comes down to is making sure you get the desired outcome. And a lot of this comes from what is known as the dialectic. In philosophy, you have this outlook of the world where every phenomenon in reality, every event is caused by a thesis and an antithesis coming into clash and creating a synthesis, a third outcome, right? So what happens is that for the Rothschild family, on a philosophical level, what they understand is that if you have a thesis, if you have something that comes about, you want to control the synthesis, you want to control the outcome. So you control the antithesis, you control the opposition to whatever it is that you're trying to control and manipulate, right? So it's like, okay, we have this system called capital. The Rothschild family and these banking institutions, they created capitalism. They are the face of capitalism. So you have this thesis, right? So naturally, what comes about as opposed in opposition to capitalism, you have workers unions, you have labor rights organizations, you have social justice movements, because naturally the contradictions of capitalism are going to be so bad, poverty, disparity, that you're going to have opposition at some point, right? So instead of fighting that opposition, instead of beating the crap out of it, why not bring them in? Why not control that opposition, so that it's not only does it not overtake you, but it actually makes you stronger. And it's actually really brilliant from a tactical perspective, because it's sort of like, I think a good example of it is like parenting, right? It's like if you're a parent and you have a kid, and your kid's like, oh, I want to go to this park, and you're like, no, this park is dangerous, there's people fucking smoking crack and doing all this crazy shit there, and you just tell the kid, no, it's, you can't go. The kid can leave the house, sneak out, go with his friends to the park, and just totally disobey you and go. Now, if you want to control the outcome, if you don't want the outcome, what you could say is, all right, you know what? Let's go to the park together. I'll walk you there. And then they get a little taste of how bad it is. They see people smoking crack. They see people getting jumped. And then the kid is like, I don't want to go to the park anymore. And so by doing that little controlled release, by controlling the antithesis, by predicting ahead of time what is going to be the opposition to my rule, and how do I control that and harness it so that it bolsters my system, right? That is the genius of their tactical strategy, and evil genius, I would say. And that's why you have, in the 20th century, you have Zionism funding Trotskyism. You have the Congress for Cultural Freedom. You have the rise of the New Left. You have the rise of the hippie culture, the rise of all of this stuff that was in a way a controlled release, controlled opposition for real, in order to stop real communists, real anti-imperialists from fighting against their order.
Yeah, because all of them have the strings attached to the enemy you're supposed to be fighting against, just like how they also control all the politicians. All our politicians are bought off by corporations. People who watch this channel regularly and your channel know this, but to understand the history of how all these corporations, all these industries are controlled by the Rothschild family, it helps us realize how all these politicians that take advantage of the pain and the suffering that people feel, and sometimes they say the right things. Like we know AOC, when she wags her fingers, it's like Republicans are voting for these bailouts and blah blah blah. There should be a shame, like during the 2020. But then there was like the voice vote, and then like we didn't hear her vote no. Similar to how Elizabeth Warren wags her fingers at Wall Street bankers. He's like, it's a shame that you did this, blah blah blah, and then she doesn't do anything legislatively. And now on the other side also, I mean, we have the two sides, right? Like how in wars there's two sides. We have this illusion of the Democrats and the Republicans being at odds with each other. On the surface, it may appear that way. The Republicans currently, there are two, Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz, that are calling out people for voting to fund Ukraine with weapons, $40 billion, right? At the end of the day, are they actually going to do anything legislatively? Anything that's going to be significant that would end these wars? No, they're pandering, they're grandstanding, because at the end of the day, all these politicians are working for the same people. Both sides are funded by the same people. So we have this illusion of this opposition, but it's not real. And we want to help raise people's consciousness so that they don't get stuck thinking that electoral politics is going to save them, right?
Yeah. No, it's a great point, and it even happens with the Israel-Palestine conflict, where you have, for example, like you have Israel, right? Like this is a perfect example, right? You have 1948, the creation of the state of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, these hardcore Zionists who create Israel, and then they know, okay, eventually we're gonna have opposition to us because we're doing some fucking crazy shit. We know eventually the Arab peoples, leftist communists are gonna oppose us, and since then, Mossad and the IDF and all of these Israeli intelligence institutions have been financing and controlling so many different groups in order to maintain the conversation within two sides. Within, are you pro-Israel or pro-two-state solution? So you have people like Noam Chomsky, you have people like Norman Finkelstein, who are paraded around in media as these quote-unquote, anti-Israel spokespeople who are critiquing Israel. But at the end of the day, you look at what they're saying, they're still legitimizing the existence of Israel. They're still saying, oh, we need a two-state, Israel needs to improve its human rights. Israel should be better at doing this. Whereas like you have Iran, which is like, no, Israel doesn't even it shouldn't even be a country. This is Palestine. Like that belongs to Palestinian people who are indigenous to that land. But yet the perspective of Noam Chomsky and Norman Finkelstein are touted as quote unquote anti-Israel opposition, as a controlled burn, as a controlled opposition. So you see that happening in so many ways. And the same thing with the Republicans and the Democrats. I think the example of AOC and Bernie Sanders is such a perfect example, because what happens with AOC and Bernie is like you have the Democrats being like, all right, Chuck Schumer and fucking Nancy Pelosi and Hillary are not popular. They are the mainstream. They are the corporate Democrats. And that's where you have another use of word magic where they say, oh, I'm a Justice Democrat. I'm part of the squad. And it's like, and they create this illusion. And AOC is an actress, dude. Like, she's playing the role of a fucking socialist who's critiquing the Democrats. But at the end of the day, they're just reading scripts. They're all going home to the same place,
They're coached. It's on both sides.
Exactly.
And then they tap into that pain, that hurt that American people are feeling. Like they're like, yeah, like Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene are saying the right thing. Like we shouldn't be in all these wars, and they vote for them, and then nothing happens. I mean, these people are still doing the bidding of the corporations. AOC talking about there should be no homeless people. I stand with women's rights, blah, blah, blah. Like tapping into the hurt that people are feeling in this country. But then at the end of the day, she doesn't do anything. Votes for more imperialism. What do you think about this? Marcus Cage says, that includes third parties. Sorry to burst your bubble, but they aren't a viable path either. Now, what I say here on this show is that because corporations, well, as we're talking about here, going even deeper, Rothschild's family and all these other powerful families control our election system, they'll never allow a third party to win. But if they win by some miracle, they still have to work with legislation that's introduced into Congress that's written by these lobbyists. What are your thoughts on that?
That's a great point, man. I think at the end of the day, I think a lot of times people give too much importance or significance to politics as opposed to economics. And this is what really distinguishes a liberal perspective from a Marxist or a historical materialist, dialectical materialist perspective, where it's not a party that's ruling over a country, it's an economic class. Like right now, the capitalist class is ruling the country. They don't give a fuck if they're wearing blue or red or if they call themselves Democrats or Republicans. As long as they're extracting surplus value, as long as they're making money, as long as their banks are growing wealthy and rich, they do not care about politics and politicians. The politics is a distraction. It's sort of like the stage and the theater that gives people the illusion of choice, the illusion of participation in democracy. Although I do have generally supported third parties in the past, I think that what it really comes down to is one of the biggest lessons that Lenin has put forward throughout history is that you have three stages of a revolution. You have first the economic revolution. You have a change in the mode of production or the relations of production, right? The economic is the primary determinant factor, right? Whether that's a recession, whether that's lockdowns, whether that's, war, unemployment, that economic base is going to determine the superstructure or what else happens, politics, laws, society. So the first stage is the economic revolution. Then you have the social revolution. So that's where you have the change in ideas and minds. For example, one of the economic revolution, and by the way, revolution is not necessarily a good or bad term. It could also mean like bad. A revolution just means something, a change that's spinning in a different direction. So one of the economic changes that happened during COVID is that you had a lot of jobs that were cut, a lot of industries that were cut, and people sort of realized like, oh shit, my job, this job is not about, like, for example, like a liberal PhD student with a degree in like underwater ballet, 19th century, like postmodern art, they're not as necessarily as they're not necessarily better or more intelligent than a plumber or a carpenter or electrician or somebody who doesn't necessarily have the merit of society but keeps the lights on and keeps society going, like the working class people. And so that economic change in the base led to a social revolution where now you have a lot of people saying, damn, maybe being a plumber or a carpenter or electrician is actually better. Like maybe like that has more value. Maybe, so the societal values change. Then the last step is a political revolution. That's when you have a political party, group, representative who initiates those changes based on the changed social values and that are rooted in the economics. So I think a lot of third parties, unfortunately, do fall in line with some mainstream media talking points. It really depends which party we're talking about. Like I know
Green Party, Howie Hawkins, prime example, how he fell for a lot of mainstream media talking points about our foreign policy.
Hell yeah, Howie Hawkins.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's like it depends on the party, right? Like I think the Green Party, for example, I would have to do more research to be 100% real with you, but like I know the Green Party has repeated a lot of liberal talking points. The libertarian parties, like the Patriot Party and all that stuff, they repeat a lot of Zionist talking points on the right. So it depends. There's always going to be shit that people repeat from mainstream media, and that's the thing, dude. Like even within the left, like I don't agree with most people on the left about COVID and COVID restrictions. Like I'm 100% with you, man. Where like I don't think the mask mandate is good. I don't think that the jab should be mandatory. I think it should be up to people. I think that we shouldn't shame people for not taking the jab. But a lot of people on the left, don't feel that way, unfortunately. So it really depends. And I think we're in an era where like we also have to move away from the labels of quote unquote left and right, because they've changed so much. At this point, the so-called left and the liberal Democrats are more pro-imperialist and more annoying as fuck than even some conservatives. Even though, like, if I'm talking to a
they're more pro-censorship right now. They're more trying to control the narrative, which is a characteristic of these ruling families with what they do with mainstream media.
Exactly. They're more pro-censorship. They're more pro-banning people. Even a conversation like this, like, they'd be in favor of banning this shit. Whereas, like, a Republican and a conservative, I'm by no means, I disagree with capitalism. I disagree with the free market and all this shit. But I would probably have a better time talking to like a conservative or Republican dude who's like, yeah, like these restrictions are crazy. Yeah, we shouldn't be funding Ukraine. Yeah, we shouldn't be censoring people. I'd probably have a lot more comment with them than some, NYU soy latte yoga mat liberal who's like, oh, we need to censor all talk about the Rothschilds and you have to get your like 35th booster shot and like all this shit, so it's just like it's changed so much that we have to move past this idea of left and right, and we're in a whole different era.
I think the majority of the people of this country don't even know where they fall. The majority are apolitical. They don't vote. And then when you talk to them and you ask them, like, they're going to have completely individual thoughts about our political state of the world. So John Kemper's mentioning how like I'm not monetized on YouTube. Yeah, I mean, they're this is one of the reasons why some people are afraid to talk about this. I was like, oh, I'm not going to be monetized on YouTube and blah, blah. So you think that's also a reason for why some people on the left are afraid to talk about or go against certain narratives? Or is that inner voice, something subconsciously telling them like, no, don't go too far. Don't go too far on COVID. Don't go too far on talking about the Rothschilds. You're not
Yeah,
going to get paid. You're not going to gain clout.
yeah,
And then they wait sometimes until it's safe enough to talk about when a bigger voice starts talking about these topics.
dude,
What do you think?
that's exactly right, man. And that's why I tell people, don't combine your activism or views or politics with your bread and butter, right? Like, have something that is your bread and butter, that makes your money, that keeps you financially stable, that is separate from your politics and your views. Because the second you combine the two, that's how they fucking control you, you know, and that's how they manipulate you and silence you. And I see this happen all the time, like where you give people a little taste of fame, a little taste of money. My channel's not monetized either for that reason. I don't make a single cent or a penny from the content I do it, because I don't want that control. I don't want people to be able to be like, oh, episode whatever, I didn't like what you said about, capitalism. That's anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. Like, no, like, nah, fuck that. You know, I don't want somebody to control me like that. And so, but I've forced and fought my way. Even if I'm cleaning floors at McDonald's or whatever it is, at least I have that independence to speak my mind, because my money, my form of living, is not dependent on media or journalism or NGO. Because once you're in that world, man, once you're in, I've worked, like I'll just give you some background on me, right? Like, I worked, so I'm 30 right now. For the past 10 years, I've been working in media, but now I'm working in the trade to become an electrician. So right now I'm an apprentice. I'm working manual labor, construction. But for the previous 10 years, I was working in media. I worked for publications. I've worked for newspapers. I've worked for all of them. You name it. I've worked for them, and in every single publication, they've always tried to silence me, suppress me, or be like, oh, if you have a blog or a podcast outside of us, like, if you publish something we don't like, you can be fired and this and that. And I just did not like that shit, So that definitely 100% plays a big role. So what did I do? I forced myself, especially after COVID, after the jab and all that stuff, to be like, all right, let me work in a field where I can make money and say what I want and not be scared of being canceled and censored, and have my livelihood canceled and censored based on something that I do. So it's 100% true. And in a way, like, I say this not even to be like a dick or to be arrogant, but like, in a way, I feel bad for a lot of the people who are stuck in that, because it does suck if you are a leftist, or if you're like, because a lot of people go into this well intentioned, right? A lot of
Yeah.
people start off like, yo, I'm gonna become a journalist and expose the lies and expose injustice, and I'm gonna work within the system, right, to expose this and that. But once you start stepping on some toes, once you start naming names, right, like the Rothschilds, like the Sackler family, then people are like, nope, you're not going to do that. So at that point, you have to say, okay, am I going to eat this week and get groceries, or am I going to tell the truth? So in a way, I say this as a message to those independent journalists or people who think like us, who are critiquing and questioning the system. Like, make sure to be sustainable on your own. Like, make sure to have a form of living that doesn't tie you down to the thoughts and opinions of these ruling elites,
Yeah, I agree with that. There are some people that started early enough on, like, to the point in which they do make enough just by doing this independently, or they work for an independent outlet like Mint Press, or some of these other Consortium News, or Press TV, or some of these other outlets. I mean, if you want to, if that's something like if someone's aspiring to be a journalist, you want to work for these outlets, I mean, you can do that. But the majority of people who want to be like a commentator or whatever, like on YouTube, like this is not going to pay the bills.
Yeah,
And if you do want to grow to a massive size, then you're more than likely going to be talking about things that aren't that important or clout chasing. You're going to be talking about drama that's happening on YouTube. That's a
yeah,
quick way to grow your channel, but does it pay off in the long run? I don't think that pays off in the long run. In the long run, being a truth teller pays off. You are helping to raise consciousness, uh, and to start you're creating a spark for change, which we really need. I mean, we want to reduce suffering. But unfortunately, if you approach it as what Ramiro was describing, you want to be a career commentator. It's going to be hard to step out of your comfort zone when there is some topics that not enough people are talking about yet. Like there was a time in which talking about COVID was not a popular thing, and I
yeah,
remember when a lot of my audience members were mad at me for taking the position that I took until more people started talking about it, more people started seeing what I was seeing,
yeah,
and then a lot of them came back or apologized. Same thing when I talked about other issues, like for example, movement for a people's party. But it's whatever. It pays off in the long run. I'm doing this because I want to help inform people. Now, I want to ask you, Ramiro, what do you think the world should be like? Because the Rothschilds family have, for generations, made us believe that this is how the system should be. Like we should have banks, we should rely on sugars, we should rely on all these other products that they sell to us, trying to control our social lives. How do you think that life should be?
I think that one of the ways in which we can begin to imagine a new world or redesign our current world is to look at countries around the world that are building socialism in a way that is beneficial to human beings. For example, last year when I traveled to Nicaragua twice, I was really taken aback by how beautiful and amazing people live in the country, even though it's not the wealthiest country. It's not, they don't have skyscrapers. Like there's not a building over like 5 stories or 6 stories. Even the city is not necessarily like a huge mega city. There's a lot of trees and greenery. Like it's very flat, but people are very happy. Nicaragua is consistently ranked among the happiest countries in the world every year because of the life that people live, because of Sandinismo socialism, because of the ability to grow where you're planted. So that's one of the main ideas of Sandinismo, is bridging the gap between rural life and urban life. So in Nicaragua, instead of forcing people to move into these cramped mega cities and work in little cubicles and industrial jobs, they help people start their own farms. They help people. The government, the Sandinista government, actually helps, especially young couples when they have kids. They bring them cows. I've seen this, that they'll have like a young family that I was staying with. They're like, oh, the local Sandinista representative, they're bringing us a cow today, and now we're gonna have a cow. We're gonna start making our own milk and cheese. They'll bring them crops and seeds to grow their own food, so that they don't have to move to the big cities and get these cute work in cubicles, crunching numbers and working for a hedge fund, doing magic and doing social media. They can be out in nature. They can be growing shit. They can be building shit, and be with their families. Have extended families, multi-generational living, grandparents, great grandparents living in the same household as kids playing outside. When I was in Nicaragua, I did not see a single kid like glued on their phone, hunched over. The way I feel bad for some of the like I think me and you, Franco, are both millennials. Like I see a lot of the Gen Zers in the U.S. And honestly, I feel bad for a lot of them because they're so addicted to social media and smartphones, and they're hunched over on TikTok all day, just scrolling up. And you see kids in socialist countries like Nicaragua who are outside building shit, who are playing, who are growing stuff. And I think really that's what life should be like. I think life should be, in a way, back to nature. And I don't want to say this as like sort of like liberal, like, oh, we need to go back in time and be primitive. Not at all. We need to use
Hmm.
technology adequately. Scientific
Yeah.
socialism. We need to use technology in a way that benefits us. As Marx says in the German ideology, this is one of my favorite quotes, and I'm going to paraphrase here. Just as just as just as religion is a product of man's mind and dominates him, capitalism is a product of man's hand and dominates him. So the products that we create under capitalism, like an iPhone and all this other stuff, even though as human beings we created them, we're subservient to them. They're used as tools by the ruling class to keep us distracted, keep us scared, keep us isolated, keep us paranoid, keep us, all these things. And we should use technology more efficiently. Just because the technology is there doesn't mean we have to use it. And that's what I found really interesting about Nicaragua is that, like, a lot of the young people I spoke to out there, I'm like, oh, do y'all use TikTok? Do y'all do this? They're like, yeah, we've heard about it, but I'd rather play outside. I'd rather grow, plant trees and shit, and go swimming in the lake, and live simply, live from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs. Work as much as best as you can, doing what you do, doing what you love, and work in a way that provides value to people, right? Bankers do not provide value to society. Hedge fund managers do not provide value to society. Bakers provide value. Plumbers, farmers, carpenters. Those are people who, nurses, they provide value to society. And you should get resources according to your wealth. You shouldn't be, your wealth should not be stolen by all these capitalist institutions that then use your money for fucking war in Ukraine and Zelensky and all this shit. So I think what it really comes down to is living according to your means, living according to nature, living according to human existence, and not this digital AI, social media hell landscape that we exist in now. And I think, in my opinion, I think the only way to really do that is to get rid of capitalism, a system that was created by families like the Rothschilds and many others who want everyone to be enslaved and to worship money. That's really what it comes down to. The capitalists want people to worship money and fame and greed and ego and lust and all these horrible things. We have to get back to nature. We have to get back to humanity. Use technology in a rational way to advance society, but not be slaves to the technology that we create.
Yeah, being more self-aware about it, right? So you're not don't so you don't have so you're not addicted to it. But yeah, man, like we mentioned earlier, like the Rothschilds family control, just like they control alcohol, sugar, which is so distributed. Oh, Ramiro left. Well, I'll just keep saying this. Just like how the Rothschilds family control sugar, alcohol, and all these other products to try to make us really dependent on it, make it be like these like guilty pleasures of ours, sugar. And now that they have control over all these GMOs like corn and soy and how they're heavily used in all our foods, I mean, our world doesn't have to be like that. We can diversify and have healthier foods. We don't have to be relying on banks. And now, I mean, they have control over our social media platforms, which also are tied with the transhumanist agenda with Meta, right? Elon Musk now trying to own Twitter. Elon Musk and Neuralink, someone who was vetted by the Rothschilds family, Elon Musk, received funding from banks, received funding from the Pentagon, all of which control, what's our Pentagon controlled by? It's controlled by banks and these families. And what's the World Economic Forum also doing? They're not only are they helping to, not only are they indoctrinating, creating these politicians like across the world, but they are also pushing for this transhumanist agenda, trying to have us be more dependent on technology, have there be more surveillance. So like I've been saying, like they're trying to have us be so dependent on technology, less dependent on nature, and all of that affects our mental health, etc. So it's a shame that Ramiro got kicked out of the stream. I'm gonna wait a little bit for him to come back on so that I can give a proper farewell to my good friend. Let's see what some of you guys are saying. All right, so you guys are talking about how you guys wish you could go to other countries and test it out and see, because Ramiro was talking about how life is so different in Nicaragua. I can't wait to travel to more countries in the global south and experience that, because with Twitter, all the arguments and stuff, I mean, you need a mental health break from that. There's so much anger and wrath on Twitter, all these arguments that we get into. People are talking about how life was in the 90s. Optimism of the Will says, I haven't been there since 90. Okay, so he's talking about some country, but in the 90s, I mean, I remember the 90s as a millennial, like the late 90s, early 90s, I was way too young, but we were less dependent on technology. We would play outside more for sure. But yeah, guys, thank you guys so much for watching. The Rothschilds family. Why do you think the left isn't talking about them enough? Are you going to help push left independent media to talk about this family more and their significance around the world and how they have influenced the way that we live today, our social lives, all the wars that we have? Let me know in the comments. Like this video, share this video, subscribe to this channel if you have not yet subscribed. And as I always say, you're not alone, and I know that you'll stay informed. And thanks very much to our guest, Ramiro, who you guys should subscribe to. And before I forget, I should also share his channel info. All right, so here's Ramiro Sebastian Funes. You guys should definitely check that out. For more on the Rothschilds family, he had a great interview with Mohsin Abbas, Press TV journalist. There you guys have it. All right, guys, take care.